Hey guys, welcome back. Quick video for you today. Just wanted to share one of the projects that we've been working on this past year on our property that you can absolutely incorporate onto yours as well. And that's creating a deer trail to connect different parts of your property. We've made several videos in the past on either creating or enhancing deer trails on your property. So this is not the first video on the topic, and it will definitely not be the last, because creating or enhancing deer trails on our property is essential if we want to have predictable and consistent movement throughout the property. Throughout this video, I do want to talk about a few different things. First, how did we go about making this trail? What goes into that? Why did we decide to put it where we did? Secondly, how do we maintain this trail going forward? And finally, how can we enhance this trail to make sure that it stays attractive and the deer continue to use it going forward? So to start things off, how did we make this deer trail? Or I guess we should start with why we chose this location, why we chose this route for our deer trail. And I guess before we even talk about why we chose this path, maybe I should touch on why we're even doing this in the first place. And hopefully the reason is self-explanatory, but we're going to touch on it anyways. If you want to have consistent, more predictable movement on your property, then you should be trying to connect different focal points on your property with these trails, with these deer trails, travel corridors, or steering tunnels. You're going to have deer moving through your property, but you can make their movement a lot more consistent, a lot more predictable by creating your own trails or by enhancing existing deer trails. And having a lot more consistent and predictable deer movement within your property borders makes the deer that are using your property that much easier to hunt, which is one of the main reasons why we spend so much time creating these paths. So now we can move on to why we chose this path for our deer trail. And it goes back to what we just talked about. We're trying to connect different focal points on our property. Behind me, about 50, 60 yards, we have a bedding area. And behind the camera, about another 30, 40 yards, we have a food source. So we are trying to connect a bedding area that's behind me to a food source that's behind the camera. So this is going to be the route that the deer take as they leave that bedding area and travel to the food source. Another reason we chose this exact route for our desired deer trail is because of how the habitat and the terrain laid out in this area. So to my left, camera right, we have a cattail marsh that stays flooded for most of the year. And so right as we get to this area, this is where it kind of dries out. It creates a nice edge right here. Deer really like to move along edges. We also have another edge in the form of elevation change. We're at the bottom side of a little hill. Now this is not a big hill. This is maybe only a 6 to 7 foot tall hill right here. And what you'll notice when you have a small hill like this is when they're able to, deer really prefer to travel along the bottom part of this hill. And that's because they can remain hidden as they travel down this path from anything on top or on the other side of that hill. So we can take three things that we know that deer really want to do and bake them all into this one trail to really increase the probability that they'll use it. First, we are connecting two different focal points on our property. We're connecting a bedding area to a food source. We're also traveling right along with a very distinct edge, a habitat change. We are right on the north side of this cattail marsh, right where it starts to dry out a little bit. And deer really love to work and travel along edges. We are also right on the bottom part of this small hill right here. And we know that when they're able to, deer really prefer to travel along with the hillside along the bottom part of that hill. So those are a few of the reasons why we chose this exact route when we started to create this deer trail. But now let's talk about how we actually created this deer trail. For the most part, deer are lazy and they want to take the path of least resistance. Like we just said, this route right here already has a lot of ingredients that would make it attractive for a deer trail. However, unfortunately for them, a lot of this area was blocked off with downed trees, a lot of junk that was impeding their movement, blocking their movement, forcing them around this area. So if the deer on my property wanted to get from a bedding area behind me to a food source behind the camera, it would have been very difficult for them to walk down this path. So once we've established the route that we want these deer to take from point A to point B, the next step is simply to grab the chainsaw and blaze a trail to give these deer that path of least resistance. When I'm making these deer trails on my property, I'm making them anywhere from 4 to 8 feet wide. 4 feet would be as narrow as I make them, and then 8 feet would be as wide as I make them. And it doesn't stay 8 feet. 8 feet is just how I start it, and over time, the vegetation along the sides starts to grow into the middle. That's totally fine. But initially, I think I do make these trails around 8 feet wide, just so I can get my equipment up and down the trail as I create them. So now that we've cleared the path and we've opened up the trail to get these deer from the bedding area behind me to the food source behind the camera, we have given them that path of least resistance. This is likely already going to be the trail that they take from that bedding area to that food source. But depending on the habitat that you're working with, where are you carving this deer trail, you might need to do a little bit more work to encourage more daylight use out of these trails. And it has to do with the fact that deer really want to feel safe and secure as they're moving from point A to point B. If you're carving your trail through thicker cover, a lot of times those deer are going to feel safe as they move through the area because it's already thick. However, if you're trying to create a deer trail through more open hardwoods, that's going to be a little bit more difficult to get that consistent daylight movement because deer don't feel comfortable moving through open hardwood. So you'll have to take down a few more trees to get sunlight to the forest floor to get that area thicker over time. And depending on the size of your trees and the species, maybe you could hinge a few trees to the side just to give that immediate cover. So as these deer are moving along that path, they feel a little bit more secure, a little bit more safe as they move from point A to point B. This trail right here does get a lot of daylight use, which shows that the deer do feel comfortable as they're moving up and down it. As you can see, I do have a lot of structure on both sides, and what helps me on this one as well is I do have that hillside right there. Like we said, deer like to travel along the bottom part of that hill because they can use the upper portion of the hill as a screen, as cover as they move along it. As far as maintaining this trail or the trails on your property, that process is fairly simple. Really, all we're trying to do is make sure that this trail remains open. If there's ever a time where a tree blows over, or maybe you're trying to get more sunlight to the forest floor to thicken up the edges, and that tree comes over and blocks your path, you just need to make sure that you are sectioning out that tree to make sure that you're not impeding any movement. So as you can kind of see here, I did have a section of logs right here. I had to remove those to establish the trail initially, but as I was working on bedding to the north here, I was dropping a few trees, and because I don't fight tree lean a whole lot, you know, a few of the tops ended up in my deer trail over here. So I had to kind of clean that up a little bit to make sure that my movement along this trail was not blocked. The piece of equipment that I use the most for maintaining these deer trails is my riding lawnmower. And that's the main reason why I make these a little bit wider, just so I can get up and down with my riding lawnmower without banging the mower deck on these big logs that are laying perpendicular to my deer trail. And finally, I want to talk about how we're planning on enhancing this deer trail. Even though we are getting daylight movement as these deer come out of the bedding area behind me, work along this trail, hit a mock scrape, and then head off to the food source, there are still ways that we can work to improve it to try to encourage more daylight use. And for this individual trail, that comes in the form of security cover along the edges of the trail. Now, along the north side here, we do have that hillside. We do have a lot of cover along the north edge of this trail. I'm not really gonna be focusing on that, but if you can see along the south side of the trail here, we do have some structure, we do have some cover, but there's also some open areas. Areas where deer can see clear across the cattail marsh to the other side, especially now when we had that wet, heavy snow. It kind of laid everything down. We can see too far along the south side in a few spots. So what I'm planning on doing is taking cuttings from willows, tag alders, and dogwoods and sticking them in the ground along the south side of this trail, just north of the cattail marsh, where the ground is a little wet, so those cuttings will root and take off, which will provide a screen, more security along the south side of the trail. So again, just because the deer are using this trail during daylight currently, that does not mean that there's no room for improvement. And one of the things that we're trying to improve upon on this trail is just the safety and security factor as these deer move from point A to point B by trying to thicken up the southern side of this trail. But guys, that's going to wrap it up for today's video on one of the projects that we've been working on our property, creating this deer trail, maintaining this deer trail, and trying to enhance it by adding more security cover to the southern side. If you guys do have any questions, please drop those in the comment section below, and we will see you guys in the next video.